consumers and businesses aren't causing inflation. Businesses don't cause inflation by raising prices. Workers aren't causing inflation by demanding raises. Workers need raises because of inflation. Companies are raising prices because of inflation. It's got nothing to do with psychology, and it's got everything to do with fiscal and monetary policy.
A lot of inflation remains in the pipeline. A hotter than expected producer price index, PPI, report is just one sign that inflation isn't close to cooling. A lot of people think the current inflation problem is solely the result of the monetary policy mistakes made after COVID. But as Peter talked about in his podcast, this inflation problem was decades in the making. We are paying for monetary mistakes going back to the early 1990s or even the late 1980s. It's not simply the mistakes that were made after 2020. It was all the mistakes that were made before 2020. David Schiff is an American stockbroker, financial commentator, and radio personality. Peter said in a recent podcast that it makes no sense that people keep expecting better inflation numbers and continue to be surprised when they come out worse than expected. Let us listen to the rest of the video and see what his views are.
Policy. Then, in response to another question, Powell was very forthright in his admission that inflation was a lot higher and had lasted a lot longer than the Fed had anticipated. So again, this is tantamount to saying we got it wrong, we made a mistake, and now we need to correct that mistake by staying tighter for longer or going higher than the markets expect. In fact, Powell reiterated something that he had said in the past, that the risk is doing too little on tightening and not doing too much. Powell further stated that he would prefer to over-tighten rather than under-tighten, because if the Fed tightened too much, according to Powell, the Fed has the tools to support economic activity if necessary. But if we don't tighten enough and inflation gets out of control, well, then it will become entrenched and then it will be too late. And so the Fed is going to err on being too tight. Again, those are very scary comments, especially if you are expecting the Fed to adopt a softer tone. And by the way, Powell is wrong to think that if they just tighten too much, meaning they tighten so much that the economy really weakens into a severe recession, that the Fed has the tools to prop it back up and stimulate it to support economic activity. It doesn't. Because if the fight against inflation drives the economy into recession, if the Fed then uses those very tools to support the economy, well, then inflation is going to take off and get much worse. You see, if the Fed is really committed to fighting inflation, then those tools are no longer at its disposal. The fact that Powell is so quick to admit that he's going to use those tools if the inflation fight does too much damage to the economy really reveals that the Fed is not as committed to fighting inflation as it maintains or as the markets believe. Because as I've said many times, the Fed's commitment to fighting inflation stops if it brings about a severe recession or a financial crisis. Yes, the Fed is willing to tolerate a very mild, shallow recession, but anything greater than that, and the Fed is going to use its tools. And in fact, I think that it's going to use those tools long before inflation gets anywhere near 2%. But even in the extremely unlikely situation where the Fed got inflation back down to 2% because of its tightening, and then with inflation at 2%, the Fed then used those tools to stimulate the economy, anything it had achieved in reducing inflation will be lost, and the inflation rate will spike back up again. So even if inflation does go to 2%, the Fed still can't use those tools. But I have never heard Powell acknowledge that if the economy goes into a severe recession or a financial crisis, that it's not going to matter, because the Fed is going to continue to tighten and maintain tight monetary policy to make sure inflation not only goes down to 2%, but stays at 2%, no matter the consequences. I don't think Powell will ever speak those words, and I think before he has to, there will be a hard pivot. And in fact, I still believe that there was a soft pivot. It's just that Powell didn't follow through in the Q&A.
According to Peter Schiff, the aberration was the inflation of 2% or less that we got following the 2008 financial crisis. Now, what we are going to have is a lot of high inflation to make up for all those years of low inflation. It's a reversion to the mean. Except we're not going to revert to the mean. We're going to revert to something much higher than the mean because of massive and unprecedented money printing that has gone on, not just since COVID, but before COVID.
I think that pivot was in fact written in to the prepared remarks, but Powell went off script and went back to his newfound hawkishness. But I think one of the reasons that Powell had the courage to be a hawk was that in response to the trial balloon the Fed floated and what I called the soft pivot, there was a big rally in the bond market. There was a big rally in the stock market. And that rally enabled Powell to be a lot tougher than he was in the depths of the collapse. But now that Powell has returned to his hawkish rhetoric, the market crash that the Fed interrupted is going to resume. And I think when faced with those circumstances again, especially if it's the bond market, not just the stock market, I think Powell is going to have to come back and clarify his remarks. And by clarify, I mean do a complete 180 and say the opposite of what he said, but without actually acknowledging the screw up. In other words, the Fed is stepping on the brakes while the government is stepping on the gas. Obviously, that's a problem. Now, I don't know, maybe Powell didn't understand this question, which is really scary, but here's the way Powell answered the question. He said, at first, you would have thought that it would have been a headwind, but then it wasn't, because he said households had so much savings that they were able to keep on spending despite this headwind. That answer makes no sense, because that's a headwind on spending and the economy, not a headwind on the inflation fight. Powell was saying, hey, we thought that fiscal spending would be a headwind, but it wasn't, because households made up the difference by spending anyway. But the fiscal policy added to spending. It didn't subtract from spending. It gave households even more money to spend. His answer made no sense whatsoever. Powell implied that he was worried about fiscal policy because it was going to take spending away from consumers, and that it turned out he didn't have to worry because consumers were able to make up for the lack of money coming from the government with their ample savings. Well, first of all, they didn't have ample savings. They depleted their meager savings, and now they're at record lows. But the government didn't take away any money. That's the whole point of the question. The government provided money. Powell was thinking that fiscal policy was a headwind because it removed purchasing power from the economy. No, it added purchasing power to the economy, and that's what made it a headwind for the inflation fight. Now, doesn't Powell understand that? Or did Powell just completely misinterpret the question and not understand what it meant? Because the headwind of a contractionary fiscal policy, which we did not have, would be that it would hurt the economy if you believe the economy is driven by spending, but it would have made the Fed's job easier to fight inflation. So it wouldn't have been a headwind in that respect. It's only a headwind because it makes it harder to fight inflation, and it makes it harder by stimulating spending when the Fed is trying to sedate spending. But according to Powell, there wasn't a headwind because consumers increased their spending anyway. But if they did that, that was a headwind, because what Powell needs to do to reduce inflation is to reduce spending. He needs to increase savings, neither of which have been accomplished. The savings rate is going down as consumers continue to spend. And that's why Powell has not observed any progress in inflation.
People believe the Fed is going to be victorious in its fight over inflation, and if it isn't, they believe the recession will do the job for the Federal. But it won't. Inflation is going to get a lot worse as a result of this inflation getting worse. So, we're going to have the worst of both worlds. We're going to have very high inflation, higher than we have now, and an even deeper recession than the one we're in now. Girdle up and get ready for your world to be rocked. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.